Good afternoon, everyone. Carasoft Technology would like to welcome you to our VMware webinar. Today, we are lucky enough to have Will Grismore, Chris Cook, and DJ Antonucci joining us today. Will, I would like to hand the floor over to you.
Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about migrating from NSX-V to NSX-T. And as Sydney mentioned, we have Chris Cook with us, and DJ, thanks for joining me today, guys. It's great to have you with us. This is going to be a webinar that's going to focus primarily on, migrating from NSX-V to NSX-T and how 27 Virtual as a VMware preferred partner is able to help customers make that migration process happen. This is going to focus on a particular example case study. So it's just one example migration. We'll be doing more of these in the future as well with different examples. So the idea here is to really focus on that. In the chat, I put a link to this workbook, which is the Migrate to VMware NSX-T Data Center workbook. It's a 123-page document that walks you through a lot of details of migration. It's a very helpful tool to help you guys migrate. I was one of the authors in there as well, and you can definitely leverage that, at the end of this webinar. So again, this is going to focus on a real-life migration. And throughout this process, you're going to see some questions coming up. You can just answer these questions to these polling questions. It'd be fantastic. Gives us some feedback there. So the first polling question is, when are you looking to migrate to NSX-T, right? 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months? So definitely go ahead and answer those questions as we go along. It gives us some feedback and helps us kind of understand, where we're at in the process. This case study focuses on a lift and shift migration with a large customer in the financial services industry that had more than 15,000 firewall rules. And at some point they had like 18,000, somewhere in that range. And they also had a lot of NSX-V segments that needed to be migrated. So we're going to talk about that particular case study and the tools that were used to do the migration. The primary tool that was used was the REST NSX tool and the REST NSX migration assistance tool. We also leveraged some 27 virtual custom scripting. So, why 27 virtual? One of the reasons would be the experience that we use in these migrations, the working with the REST NSX team, and also our own custom scripting. So how do we go about doing a V to T migration? The first step is a general environmental assessment. I'm not going to go through all the details of each one of these, but you definitely need to look at the compute. You need to look at the network. You need to look at the storage. So the next question here is, have you recently assessed your environment for V to T? Is that something you've actually looked at or not? So it's definitely something you want to consider as you're going through this is, am I actually ready for the migration? At the compute level, what hardware do we have? Is it on the hardware compatibility list? Are we looking to do a lift and shift migration? Do we have the hardware we need to do that? Do I need to purchase additional hardware or new seed hosts or repurpose existing hardware? What is your current vSphere design? One of the most important things is in the network. What are the PNICs? What are the physical network adapters in my NSX-V ESXi hosts? Are they on the hardware compatibility list? Do they support NSX-T Geneva offload? Is your environment already set to the proper MTU at the host level and across your physical route switch infrastructure? Am I using Cisco UCS or HP Virtual Connect? How does that affect my network cards and the connections up? Any lags or VPCs configured? Real important question is, where is that layer 3 boundary? And vSAN can play a big part in how we make decisions about migrating from V to T. But just generally speaking, it's important that you have a pretty good idea of your environment and what it looks like at a basic compute, network, and storage level before you migrate. So what we do is an assessment of that before we start. Then we're going to look at, for all migrations, we're going to look at what the migration requirements are for specifically migrating from V to T. There are some very specific requirements there we need to meet. So this next question that's popping up is, what version of vCenter are you using, right? There are some basic requirements there like 6.5 or 6.7 or 7.0. You may be required to do an upgrade of that existing environment prior to starting, right? So we do this pre-migration requirement check, and then we're going to leverage the REST NSX MAT tool, which has an assessment built in it that we can actually run, right? So I'm going to stop right here and turn it over to DJ, and he's going to show us what that assessment tool looks like.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. All right, let's get started here. So DJ Antonucci from Rest NSX, great to meet y'all. We are going to go through a few different things here. Bill and I, we're going to ping pong back and forth in terms of sharing content. But the first thing I wanted to show you is what Bill was just talking about, which is the assessment capability of Rest NSX. So on the screen, you see a few different tabs open in my web browser, but the first one I'm going to log into here is the Rest NSX MAT appliance, which is a migration assistance tool. And what this is designed to do is to perform that lift and shift migration for us in an automated fashion, right? And there's a lot of benefits to our approach of lift and shift, which we'll get into. But the first one is that this is a dedicated application for migration from NSX-V to T. And the first step of that process that Bill was just covering was the assessment portion. So within our tool, again, we're somewhat speed dating here. So I'm going to go through things somewhat fast, but more than happy to answer questions as they pop out and address them. But the first thing to note here is that we add in our data sources on the left side of the screen here. So another benefit of our approach is that because we're a dedicated application, not part of the data control or management plane of NSX itself, is that we can stand off to the side and do things not possible within other tool sets, such as whatever it may be out there. So the idea is that I can have multiple data sources, multiple V managers, all going to the same NSX-T manager. Again, this could be a local manager, global manager, doesn't matter. We support federation, non-federated. The choice is yours as it comes to that. So we can take up to 12 V managers and collapse them down to a single T manager. Obviously, that's beneficial for some of the larger V customers who had to scale out horizontally V managers because of scale issues of V, and T obviously has much higher scale limits, so people want to consolidate them back together. We support an architecture like that. But the first step of this process of the assessment is, one is adding in my data sources, adding in my vCenter, my NSX manager, and selecting options for this assessment. So I'm going to go into more details of these in a few minutes, but in summary, we're going to tell the tool how we want to migrate when we get to that point. But for this point of the discussion, we're just going to focus on the assessment. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to launch a collection. So this is all being done via RESTful APIs to the NSX-V environment and to the source vCenter. And the point of this is to collect all the data, all your inventory, but more importantly, it's to identify a lot of the objects and policies that aren't compatible with NSX-T that have to be considered using our tool or not for the migration. So for example, if I'm using an NSX-V, a cluster in a firewall rule, that's perfectly acceptable in NSX-V, but an NSX-T, that is not, right? An NSX-T has to be an IP address or a security group. That's the only thing allowed in a source destination or applied to in an NSX-T firewall rule. So there has to be some sort of manipulation or what we call transformations of that data to get it to NSX-T. So we highlight that in what we call our assessment report, which we'll show here at the end of the collection. And in that assessment report, we're marking things as greens, oranges, and reds. And that's very intentional because we want to highlight things that if you use our tool or not, if you want to do this manually or some other method, you're going to have to take into account these things like the cluster in the firewall rule, or maybe you're using a VNIC or any vCenter centric object, if you will, within the firewall rule set. So we're going through the environment. Again, the source environment is not that large. It's a few hundred firewall rules, but it has ESGs, DLRs, has a full suite of NSX-V capabilities. And the goal here is for within 5 minutes to an hour, depending upon the size of your environment, is produce this assessment report. So you can sit back, look at it with 27 Virtual, go through the report and say, okay, I didn't know that I had a bunch of firewall rules with what we call naked VMs in them, which is a common problem. Customers love to put a virtual machine directly in a firewall rule as a source of destination. That's great in V, but as I mentioned, T does not support that. So you have to transform it in some way. If you use our tool, we will automatically do that for you. And that's what we call intent-based migrations, which is, okay, I know what you have in V, T doesn't support it, so let me transform it into something that is compatible in NSX-T. So that would be a security group with the VM as a member instead of a VM naked in the firewall rule. Again, that's one of many examples that we'll jump through here. But As it wraps up here, it's probably another 30 seconds. I'm going to bring up my source environment so we can take a look at it. If I could put it here. And I just want to show you real quick as it's finishing up there, the firewall rules that I've been talking about. So in our report, we're going to have a bunch of firewall rules flagged as informational. What that means is, Mr. Customer, you have VMs in your firewall rules. You have clusters, you have data centers, you have distributed port groups. The list goes on and on. Those aren't supported in NSX-T. So all these rules are going to be marked as info, saying, okay, they're going to be effectively the same rules in NSX-T when we migrate them, but they're just going to look a little bit different. And we'll see that when we do the actual migration here in a few minutes. So when we do this migration, we want to make sure we keep in mind this one rule that has a cluster in it, and then this one rule that has a security group in it that has tagging criteria. Because it's going to be a very important concept in a migration that may not occur in a single weekend. So the benefit of a lift and shift approach is that I can migrate over time. But if I migrate over time, I may have workloads split between my V domain and my T domain, and they may need to communicate or to some shared services. And if I have things like cluster membership or a VM in a rule or a security tag, that's not possible. And Bill is going to go into a lot more detail in our use case here of why that's important of injecting what we call zero trust or temporary IP sets in this environment. Then we go back to the tool. It's finished its collection. And before I turn it back over to Bill, I'm going to highlight a few things. One here is we can download the assessment report in different versions. I'll just download the PDF version here. And when I load this up, this is essentially what we're seeing on the screen here, but it's in a more consumable format, PDF, CSV files that I can do filters on, whatever it may be that I want to do in the environment. But it's essentially a summary of, okay, how many objects of these different types do I have? And back to the firewall example, sorry, I scrolled right by there. So we have rules with unsupported objects in them. So this would be that cluster. This could be the naked VM or anything else in there. So it's a very quick way to see, all right, what is my migration going to look like in a summary view? But it's also my full inventory of my entire data, right? All the way down to security groups, tags, what VMs are members, DLRs, what interfaces are connected, whatever it may be. So with that, I'm going to stop, send it back over to Bill, and then we'll dive back into REST NSX when we get into more of the assessment portions.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that tool. So it's great to have that tool that you can go to that's going to give you the information you need to do that assessment. You can definitely do a regular assessment, and we definitely do manual checks of everything, but there's nothing like using software and tools to get exact details out, because human error can be an issue. Here's a question just popped up. What virtual distributed switch version are you using, right? So that's definitely going to be an interesting question there as well. So those things are important. So we assess the environment, we look at the compute, the network, the storage at a very high level, make sure we understand what the environment looks like. We do a regular kind of a manual assessment, and then we can also leverage this MAT assessment as well, right? Yep. And we'll get back to this slide here in just a minute about optimization. So DJ, hold your thoughts on this one. We'll come back around to this one here in just a minute, but here is the pre-migration requirements. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it is important that you kind of screenshot this one, if you will, to make sure you have an idea of what the requirements are. You can also use the link that I put in the chat for the workbook. It kind of goes through what those requirements are. You can also use the VMware website. Now, what's important here, the most important thing here is in the top left corner is what is the use case that you have, right? So this particular case study, the use case is a large number of firewall rules that need to be migrated. And there's also some logical switches using NSX-V that need to be migrated over. So we got to make sure we understand what all those different use cases are. Also, what license level do you have for NSX-T? Now, the license level for T is important because we need to know what the design is going to be that you're going to migrate to. The version of vSphere, the version of the VDS is important. There are some things in there, and then knowing the use case, because I might be migrating just firewall rules. I might be migrating just networking, or I might be doing both. And then there are some other services in NSX-V, whether it's a load balancer or a VPN or a NAT configuration. I have to think about those as my migration moves forward. Another thing that's also very important is NSX-V an endpoint to VRA, or is it part of an extensibility deployment for automation? And that can also make the migration a little bit more complex, right? And I also mentioned within the vSphere environment, if vSAN is in use, that's also a big consideration. And then the NSX-T licensing and the design is going to be very important as you move forward. So between using the tool and doing the assessment, you get a really good idea of the environment. Once that's all decided, we're going to say, okay, this is what this customer has. How are we going to migrate? So we have to determine the migration method. There are different migration methods. There's in place, which is not so common, right? A lot of customers, it's pretty risky. The outage is a little bit longer. So maybe I want to go to more of a lift and shift scenario, right? So lift and shift, but the question that just popped up, is that going to be the same vCenter or is it going to be a new vCenter? That's really important because it kind of changes what that lift and shift looks like. So there's kind of two versions of that. And then also, do you have existing hardware you're going to repurpose, or are you purchasing new hardware we're going to move to? Another option is the workload migration. How do we do it? Could it be a completely brand new stack, like in a different data center? In that case, I might use HCX to migrate versus a regular bridged solution. So there's kind of like coexist same vCenter bridging. Then there's different vCenter coexist with HCX. Whenever you get into having two separate vCenters, it changes the technique for the migration. For this particular case study, they had that one vCenter, right? So DJ, you want to talk about this slide real quick?
Absolutely. So this is a somewhat of an interesting slide in the sense of there's three ways, to Bill's point, of getting from NSX-V to NSX-T from our perspective, right? This is, we are a software company, right? This is what we do all day long, is make software for our customers and our partners so they can do things quicker, easier, and faster. So the goal here is to just highlight different approaches. So the first one, if you're going to migrate to T, clearly there's a manual method, right? I could collect all the data myself, use RV tools, my own scripts, collect the data, review it, understand NSX-T, what it supports, doesn't support, and essentially create a gap analysis, right? You can obviously do that. It takes more time, but it's not automated. The second approach from our opinion is that there's the migration coordinator. It's a free tool built into NSX-T. It's hard to argue with free. It doesn't support all the topologies, right? There's a lot of enhancements that have been done to it of, kind of bring your own topology type of thing. There's really no dedicated assessment mode to show you the things that I was showing you earlier. So it is an option, right, for a lot of customers who may be out there, who are maybe have simpler environments, not large scale, and need to get it done at a reasonable cost, right? Then there's the migration assistance tool, which throughout this demo and discussion, we're going to highlight the benefits of this approach. One is it's automated in the sense of, it's 4 steps from copying the configuration from V to T. That's the essence of lift and shift, is that we are making a copy of the V environment over to the T environment, and you migrate your hosts and VMs at your own pace. That's the fundamental value of lift and shift, is that I can do it at my own pace as less risk, because I'm not upgrading hosts in place and NSX manager in place and concurrent to that outage. So really, that is obviously our perspective on things. We've done migrations, other methods, right, prior to having our tool, and hence the reason we created our tool. So that's a good summary of the approaches, Bill.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's definitely great to have as many tools at your disposal to make the migration go as smooth as possible. So let's focus on this particular case study for the rest of this time. So this is a customer, very large environment. They have 20,000 firewall rules. We need to get it down. We need to minimize the rules. So we have to migrate a large number of firewall rules. There's also NSX-V logical switches. We need to migrate the workloads over, build that parallel T environment. Generally speaking, in this customer's environment, it was going to be a lift and shift with the same vCenter, right? So that's the base of that case study. The the networking portion of this for this particular customer is going to be something where we go out and pre-stage all the components as we go through it. So let's walk through the process. So how do we do it? The overall process, we do the general environment assessment, as we discussed. We look at the NSX-V source assessment using the tools and techniques we just covered. And then we determine the migration method. In this case, lift and shift, same vCenter, right? So that's where we're at with this particular case study. Then we do the NSX-T design and deploy. Is it a single site, stretch metro, multi-site light, or federation? In this particular case, it was more of a stretch metro solution. So they had the ability to fail over between 2 data centers. But that portion of it was designed separately. For this particular case study, we deployed everything and tested everything in a migration lab. So the customer had the ability to set up a dedicated lab that we could build everything and test the migration in, which is very important. That we then gathered lessons learned. And then we did that deployment in their production, the brand new Greenfield NSX-T deployment, and then the actual migration of both their prod and their pre-prod environments. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to leverage the Q&A, make it as interactive as you want as we kind of go through this particular case study. So what was the first step? We did the NSX-T design and deploy. So I'm not going to get into real specifics here, but the customer did have a fairly complex route switch environment. So we had to build out the edge design. We had to deploy the managers. We had to make sure the managers could fail over correctly. So in essence, basically doing a regular NSX-T design and deploy and getting that stood up in parallel. But we're doing this in their test environment first, and then we're going to do it in the production later, right? And it could be, in this case, this example shows the 3 NVDS design in the edges, right? All the complexities of tier 0s and tier 1s and getting that all designed and getting that in place. So that'd be the first step. Design it, get it deployed, get it ready to go, do all the testing. Now, 27 Virtual uses some very precision design templates for different customers to make this process of doing this design and deploy go as quickly as possible. We've done literally hundreds of deployments of NSX-T at this point, and we've seen pretty much everything there is to see from a design architecture standpoint. What's the next step? Well, we look at that source environment. Man, can we clean it up? And the question's popping up right now. Have you analyzed your distributed firewall rules? Like DJ was just showing you, you can have this environment with a bunch of different firewall rules. What are they made up of? Because in this particular case study, with that large number of rules, we need to look at the rules and we need to see if there's any unused rules. Can we reduce the number? Are there any limits that we might be hitting from an NSX-V and or T perspective if they have a large number of firewall rules? In this particular example, we cleaned up unnecessary rules and reduced that down by a large number. So originally, say 18,000 rules reduced by say 22%, and going through the process of bringing that down to make that migration even easier. Looking at those unsupported objects, like DJ said, this concept of having a naked VM in the rule in V and trying to clean that up. And then Chris, you want to talk about the apply to field for me?
Sure. So for this customer, as you undoubtedly had drilled into your head at this point, they had a lot of rules. And one of the primary concerns was the number of rules per host. There's a limit in NSX-T that we were getting close to. When you're moving from V to T, there is a constraint in NSX-T where you cannot have IP addresses in the apply to field. So in the NSX-V environment, they had apply to used all over the place to limit the rules to just the appropriate security groups, so that all of their rules wouldn't be applied to every single VM because of that same limit on the V side for number of rules per host. As you move things over to T, you don't have the tags in place, so the apply to wouldn't work appropriately. And so you have to do one of 2 workarounds. You can do an override at the policy level where you use an object like the NSX-T segment, so that as soon as the VM is on the NSX-T segment, it is part of the apply to group. The reason you would do that is because your tags don't exist and they don't apply to the VMs until you've done this post-migration task that we'll get to later on using the migration assistance tool. So the apply to is effectively empty until that tagging is done and the rules aren't going to be applied. So you have this workaround of using a policy level apply to, or use something like a logical switch or a group of logical switches where it's all the environment depending on how things go, or you can do a temporary allow rules, which will just be an any to any service allow rule. And that was something that we ended up choosing for this particular migration because of the rules per host limit that we were worried about exceeding.
That's great. So yeah, so the apply to is really important with firewall rules, right? Because we need to make sure that we don't surpass any kind of limit at a host level. So whenever you do a NSX-V deployment or T deployment, it's always recommended to leverage apply to, so that when we're processing the firewall rules for the VNIC on the VM at the host level, that VM doesn't have to look at all those, 10,000 rules. We look at just the 1,000 that affect me, or even smaller, the 100 rules that affect me, or the 10, whatever it is. So as we migrate from V to T, we need to think about apply to and how that affects the migration to ensure that we can do that migration in a way that's going to be, clean and supported as far as any kind of limits, especially when we have a large number of rules. So what do we do when we migrate? The most common thing we're going to be migrating is going to be the firewall rules. And what we do is we pre-build the networking services in most cases. Now, the MAT tool from REST NSX can migrate all the networking components, and you can do that if you choose to, if that's a method you want to use. Another method would be to pre-build the networking services and then just migrate the firewall rules over, because that's really the big bulk of it. The benefit of pre-building the network services, you can get it in place. You can make sure that it's working. You can kick the tires, make sure everything's, north-south routing is working, east-west is working. And then the last step is to bring those firewall rules over. Then, of course, you're going to migrate the workloads, establish a bridge, or take an outage, which we don't recommend, or maybe an HCX connection to another vCenter. And then you have to migrate your gateways from the NSX-V DLR or UDLR over to the NSX-T T0 or T1 DR. So those are the main things that we're going to be migrating as we go through the process. So for this particular case study, we're going to perform an NSX-V to T migration test. So the next question that's popping up is, do you have a test environment where you can simulate the migration? Now, if you don't, it's okay. You can still do the migration. It does give you some benefits to be able to migrate in those scenarios if you do have an environment where you can actually build it out and test it. So for this particular customer, we were able to build out a source NSX-V test environment that simulated production, say a vCenter, single cluster, some hosts, a couple hundred VMs, have NSX-V deployed in that test environment, have the NSX-V manager with the 3 controllers, and make sure the hosts are prepped, and get all the NSX-V networking deployed to simulate the production that currently exists. Then we deploy REST NSX, and we leverage Policy Engine to synchronize the production NSX-V firewall rules to the test NSX-V. And DJ, I'm going to turn it over to you to show us Policy Engine sync.
Awesome. All right. So back on me, I'm now sharing my screen again. Before I jump over to the what we call Object Analyzer and Policy Engine for the assessment and synchronization, I do want to highlight one thing from Bill's previous slide around maybe doing the networking components first and then doing firewall after. That is something that we support natively within our application and what we call selective migrations. So for example, if I only want to migrate security components or networking components, I can select and unselect them down to the object level. So in this use case, we'll just call it Bob's Crab Shack, right? Whatever we want to call this customer. We ended up doing just that, was we unselected security and the DLRs and ESGs and only migrated the logical switches to NSX-T. So that way we could pre-build the environment, test the interconnectivity, the bridges, whatever it may be. Then we reran the tool in the inverse, where we migrate security, but didn't do any network virtualization. And the really cool part within the application is that, let's say we do these in the 2 different steps I was talking about, is that if a firewall rule references a logical switch as the apply to that Chris was talking about, if we find in NSX-T that logical switch exists by the same name or the overlay ID matches the VDN ID, then we will reference it. So we will set the apply to that logical switch or segment in NSX-T, or if it's part of a security group, we will reference it. So it doesn't have to be the whole big bang of a migration of the config. So with that said, I'm going to log in now into the REST NSX application. So we're just looking at Matt, and now we're in REST NSX. REST NSX does a lot of things, but we are focused on two primary things. One here is Object Analyzer, and the other one is Policy Engine. And what that is going to allow us to do is, one, we're going to look at all the stale firewall rules in NSX-V before we migrate. So the real life use case was they had, over 18,000 DFW rules that were growing every day, and we're able to get them down to about 15,000 by using the following tool. So under tools within REST NSX is a tool called Object Analyzer. What Object Analyzer will do will review your current environment. Could be NSX-V, could be NSX-T, does not matter. But for the sake of migration, we're going to look at NSX-V. And when we begin the analysis, what we're doing is we're looking at your firewall rules, either Edge or DFW, and telling you what is in use and not in use anymore, right? Because as firewalls grow and shrink, regardless of if it's NSX or not, we know that their holes pop into firewall rules. They become somewhat of Swiss cheese. People come, people go, applications don't get decommissioned properly, whatever it may be. So what Object Analyzer does is it looks at the high level, looks at my firewall rules and tells me very simply, says, okay, what rules have hits on them and what rules have no hits? And I can quickly sort, right? So these are what we call inactive objects, but also what rules are enabled or disabled. The reason we highlight this is because this right off the bat says if there's no hits on a firewall rule based upon a time period or it's disabled, we know that firewall rule is not in use and we can delete it. So that's on the surface of how we were able to delete that 22% of this customer's firewall rules, because they had been in production a long time, didn't think there's that many stale, went through this analysis, and they spent the next week or two cleaning up firewall rules before we did the migration. But what about the elements, the objects? So for example, if I look at IP sets or security groups, I can say, okay, just because my firewall rules aren't in use, but what about the objects? So if we can look at individual objects and say, okay, they're referenced in a firewall rule, but that firewall rule is not in use because it's either disabled or there's no hits on it. So therefore, the child element, which is this IP set, is also stale or inactive, and I can delete this. There's also orphaned objects, meaning I have an IP set that isn't referenced in a security group. It's not referenced in a firewall rule. So therefore it's orphaned and standalone, and I can delete it because of that. So this is a tool that we use in that assessment phase of being able to very quickly identify the environment, what's used and not used. And obviously this is a great lab environment because I have a lot of firewall rules that are inactive for demonstration purposes. So that is what we call Object Analyzer, which is part of the assessment phase. The other one is Policy Engine. So what Policy Engine does, which does a lot of things, but in context of this discussion, is that I can set up a policy that says every 30 minutes or just one time, which is what we used in this customer use case, synchronize security groups, IP sets, vCenter tags, security tags, or DFW sections between V managers, between T managers, whatever I want to do here, and allow me to do this synchronization so I can copy one environment to the other and to get a sample representation. So in this example, I'm going to say DFW sections, and the policy is empty by default. I have to add in a source, which is this V manager, and I have to put a destination, which will be this V manager. And I'm going to say all DFW sections I want to push from this manager and ingest into this other one. So what this will do is not only the sections and rules, but also all the dependent items. So IP sets, services, security groups, whatever it may be. The customer in this scenario ran Policy Engine against that. At first, it was the 18,000 rules, copied them into the lab environment. It took about 20 hours to do, right? As soon as I click the button, I can step away and go have coffee and come back. But the process was that easy for them. And then they came in the next day. The lab NSX-V manager had all the rules, objects that it had in production, and they spun up some VMs in the lab with the same naming convention, and the testing began. So very, very quick and easy process. The Policy Engine does a whole lot of more things, but that is the essence for this use case. So with Bill, I will turn that back over to you.
Wow, that's amazing, I have to say. So basically, what we're able to do is take this tool this awesome tool from REST NSX for this particular use case, for this case study, build a test environment, take all 18,000 rules and sync them over to this test environment. Is that right, DJ?
That's exactly right. And that last bullet point is very important, is that obviously, if I'm running an NSX manager with that many objects, I want to schedule this in some off hours, because we're hitting that production NSX-V manager via just read requests, API calls, but it could overwhelm it. It's not going to affect the data plane or anything along those lines. But just note that if we have an environment that large, we want to do this in off hours. But
that's amazing. That's amazing.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we're building this test environment. So what do? You got to prep it a little bit. So do you have any seed hardware for your migration? This question's popping up in the poll. Do you? I mean, again, if you don't, it's okay. You can always kind of pull things out and then repurpose it. Ideally, if you have some seed hardware, that'd be great. Not everybody does, but this test environment has to be prepped in the target for NSX-T. So you're building a seed environment, so you can have something to migrate to and test. So make sure it's on the hardware compatibility list. I mean, we got to go to vSphere 7 at this point, right? So the NSX-T NVDS is being deprecated April, and vSphere 7 October 2022. So at this point, if you're going to build out something to test or migrate to, it's recommended to go to vSphere 7X at this point. Maybe purchase new hardware, or maybe swing some old hosts over, but build that new target that you're going to migrate to, right? And then validate your NSX-T route switch. So you want to build your NSX-T target to support the networking, just like you would in production. After that's all done, you're going to deploy and configure REST NSX map. Now, policy engine's already in place, and you're doing that sync, right? And then what we want to do is leverage the ability to inject IP sets into the source, which is zero trust mode. And DJ, I'm going to turn it back over to you again for that one.
Absolutely. So this is a great discussion point. The reason being is that customers don't typically think that they need this feature that we invented called zero trust mode. What this does is, if I have a lift and shift strategy where I'm migrating hosts and VMs over time, right? It's not that, one weekend upgrade of getting all my VMs and hosts onto T. I'm going to have VMs residing in V and T at the same time. And they may need to talk to each other, or they may need to talk to shared resources, and their policy is based upon non-IP objects, for example, tags or clusters, whatever. Because if as soon as I move a VM from a V cluster to a T cluster, I'm effectively changing the security policy of V, because that VM no longer resides. So it's no longer a member of that cluster. It's no longer a member of a security group, because it's the tagging criteria is gone, et cetera, et cetera. So we identified that and created a feature called Zero Trust. What Zero Trust does is it injects temporary IP sets into NSX-V and or NSX-T, because that is the lowest common denominator when we're talking firewall rules, right? When the firewall rule gets published from NSX down to the ESXi host, it gets converted down to raw IP addresses. So we talk raw IP in the policy to make sure the communication can still occur for these slower migrations. In this customer use case, we had thousands of IP sets, and I'm going to show you right now on how this process works. And I'm going to share it back over. And now you should be looking back at the MAT appliance migration systems tool. So this is the same page I was on before, where we're looking at the collection data, and we did that selective migration of whatever it may be. Here, on this page, I can do a few things. One is I can download that assessment report. I can also download via CSV file those zero trust IP sets. So it's going to be a series of files that says, okay, rule number 1 needs a source IP of 1111, right? Because there is a VM in it, and we need to inject that temporary IP set. So we give you the raw data if you want to create the objects themselves. In this use case, 27 Virtual used their own scripting to do this. This was prior to us having this feature that I'm about to show you. And when we started this project, this feature existed in the sense of you could download the file, we give you the data, and then you'd have to script it yourself. Since then, we've made it automated via one button push. So in this example, I'm going to click Review Transformations, which is our recommendations of what T is going to look like if you click this Begin Migration button. But before I click the button, I want to go back to what we call our dashboard and you'll see a new button show up here. And this is the Zero Trust IP set creation. So if I click on this, it tells me what rules, based upon the settings I set up in the application, require that temporary IP set. So I'm going to unselect all of them for the sake of time, and I'm just going to do testing objects, right? This is the section that we're looking at right here. And note this rule that has a cluster, and this rule that has a security group with a tag only. These are going to receive those temporary IP sets. I did not select naked VMs or VNICs or distributed port groups. We give you the option of what you want to select. For the sake of time, I did that. So in this example, I'll say create. We're going out to NSX-V and creating the IP sets that we calculated. And then we're also injecting them into the firewall rule. So when we look at testing objects again here, we're going to see that this cluster rule now has a temporary IP set in it with all the IP addresses of the VMs in that cluster. So this is that cluster, same thing. Down here, if we look at the security group with the tag, it has one VM that's effective member and its IP address. We took the IP address and put it in this temporary IP set. What this means is that no matter if the VM resides on V or T, this rule is going to remain effective because it's done by IP address. And that's what NSX cares about along these lines. So it's an automated approach for you injecting these temporary IP sets. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bill, and then we're going to get into a migration here in a few minutes.
Awesome. Again, great tooling. Yeah, so this is a really important feature, be able to inject those IP sets, and then we can migrate. And even if the VMs, some VMs are on V, some are on T, I haven't flipped the gateway yet. They're still talking. Everything works. It's a wonderful thing. And then we can actually do a distributed firewall rule migration dry run. So that means that we're going to migrate rules into the target T, but have the ability to roll back. So one thing that's cool about the MAT tool, it's got a built-in rollback feature. So you can migrate the rules over, after you've done your IP set injection, you're good. You understand what's going on. The rules are cleaned up. You're ready to migrate. You can do a dry run and get those guys over and just kind of make sure it looks good. In this case, we had a large number of rules. So we could do a dry run to make sure we're supporting the limits, making sure that it works. And then we can use the REST NSX MAT tool to roll back as needed. So there is a rollback capability, which is really, really cool. And this just kind of shows you visually. So there's your V environment. We just saw the injecting of the IP sets and getting that into the environment, right? And then we're going to have a bridge in place that allows us to migrate. And we can take it kind of step by step. So now we're going to prepare for the actual test migration. So we're going to test all the NSX-T networking in the target to make sure it's good. We're going to deploy bridges as needed. Bridging is kind of complicated. Follow 27 Virtual's V2T bridge steps. You can reach out to 27 Virtual for details on how to do that. Every single customer's environment is a little bit different. We're leveraging the REST NSX policy engine, as we saw, to sync from V to V to make sure we have what we need. We're putting some test workloads out there, and then we're going to actually migrate. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Back to you again, DJ, on that.
Awesome. All right. I feel like we need to keep score. We're ping-ponging back and forth. All right, so I'm back into the MAT tool. I've injected those temporary IP sets into NSX-V. On the far side, I have my NSX-T manager 3.x with running policy mode. Another important feature of our approach that I highlighted earlier is that we could take multiple V managers, migrate them to a single T manager, but we can also migrate to an existing T manager. So in this example, this T manager has a tier 0, one segment, a few DFW policies. Again, nothing that we are going to push over, just something that happened to be here already on this existing manager. So we're not going to overwrite it. We're just going to add to whatever it may be in this environment. So in terms of requirements for what needs to be here, you need to have your T cluster installed. You need to have the VIP set up, API access to it for read-write capabilities. And depending upon what you're going to migrate, you may or may not need the following. So if I'm just doing DFW with IP sets, I don't need any of my fabric setup, especially now on VDS, et cetera. But if I am doing logical switches, DLRs, ESGs as well, I need at least one or more edge nodes and one or more edge clusters. So in my environment here, I have a few different edge nodes, different sizes, where I'm going to be putting ESGs and load balancers. And then I also need at least one edge cluster. And I can group them however I want within the system. As soon as I have that, I can go back into the application and click resume. When I click resume, it's going to load back on this transformations page, which is our recommendations for what we're going to do based upon the settings that we selected at the very beginning. So let's go look at that DFW section we were looking about earlier. So under DFW, you notice I can do a bunch of things as well. I can override, I can say, map this DFW section to an existing section or create a new one, change the apply to on the fly from DFW to a NS group that may already exist in NSX. So I can do a lot of things on the fly here. So if I'm looking at, so on page 2 here, testing objects, you notice it's marked as info. And this is also in your assessment report. And you notice the rules are marked as OK or info. OK is, NSX-T natively supports what you have here, right? You have an IP set with a negate on here, 2 negates, and we're going to create that no problem, whatever it is. We also let you know in the recommendation column, which is this last column here, of what we're going to do and the reason why. So in that example, we're going to skip it for the zero trust feature because it's IPs already. We don't need to create these temporary IP sets. But down on the rules where we saw that cluster, for example, or 2 VMs, here's the cluster one. Here's the cluster and the source. We're marking it as info because T doesn't support that, but we're also letting you know we're going to inject that temporary IP set. So based upon my settings, I'm going to create the zero trust NS group. And I'm also going to create a security group for the source that has all the VMs in it. So this is a like for like object. So this will make a little bit more sense when we do the migration here. But this is a full preview that you can download the report, review it before you click this begin migration, review it, whatever you want to do, and do override of settings. You can even go down to the ESG DLR level and say, all right, this ESG, I want to put it on a specific edge node, collect, whatever it may be. If I want to look at logical switches, I can override settings and say, okay, I'm going to put the admin state down and not connect it, right? Even though it was connected in V. So I can really be prescriptive about what this migration looks like. But let's say I've reviewed everything, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to do this lift and shift migration. When I click this begin migration, very important point of lift and shift is that we are copying from V to T. So we're not interrupting NSX-V workloads, right? Because we're just copying over. So I'm going to click begin migration. It's going to do a test read and delete on NSX-T because obviously I want to be able to delete if I want to roll back. Click begin migration, and it's going to warn me that says, in NSX-T, there are 83 rules that are going to receive those temporary security groups for the zero trust. I'm okay with that because I need them. So at this point, I click the begin migration and it starts creating the environment. So it's creating those zero trust objects. It's going to proceed with services, security groups, or NS groups, DFW rules, et cetera. It can go down the list. This whole process, as you can see, for this environment is about 6 minutes. It's going to finish a little bit sooner than that because I'm going to focus more on DFW. As soon as it publishes the first DFW rule, I'm going to go into NSX-T and look at the environment. In the top right corner, you're going to see some stats being populated here, right? Objects migrated, errors, warnings, and post-migration tests. So these are obviously very important because our goal is to migrate 95% of the configuration to NSX-T. And there's just some things that NSX-T does not support. For example, multiple app IDs with a service in a firewall rule. T doesn't like it. So we're going to mark it as error. And that's some of the errors that we're seeing here, right? Because we're on the app ID section. So if I go over now back to DFW in my NSX-T environment, I'm going to see all my rules being populated within here. But if you notice, I mark them with a text called mark 1. This is how I know where this NSX manager came from. I can put whatever text I want and tag it. Say, this is from vCenter 1, and it'll show up here. So I know where it came from. So let's go to our section, refresh here, called Testing Objects. NSX-T and take a look. So in this environment, expand some columns here. We're going to look at that one with the cluster. So we have the temporary IP set here that has, there's 3 IP addresses of the cluster in it, or the VMs that were in that cluster. But we also have a NSX-V cluster object. This is a security group, and we put in VMs in it that were members of that cluster in V. So this also brings up a very important point where maybe I'm going to a different vCenter, which I'm doing here. So I have 2 VMs in the security group because they happen to be in the inventory of NSX-T. But you didn't see me move any hosts over. You didn't see me move any VMs. The reason being is that we reference objects based upon their UUID or their name. So in V, I happen to have a VM called that. And in T, I have the same thing, even though they're not the same VMs. So we will put them in that security group, regardless if they're there or not in terms of the inventory. So that makes it very helpful for testing reasons. But let's say I didn't have these 2 VMs in NSX-T inventory yet. I haven't done a vMotion or HCX. How do I get them in there? That's what we call a post-migration task. So this migration should be done. It's almost done, working on load balancers over here. As soon as it's done, I'm going to go to what we call the post-migration page. Let's go back over to NSX-T. Networking, we have all our tier 1s created. We have our tier 0s, our segments with all their IP addresses on them. Maybe they're VLAN backed or overlay. They're all here and connected to the right tier 1s. So I'm pretty sure we're just wrapping up here on load balancers. Yep. So still going through some of that stuff. We'll let it wrap up and go to what we call these post-migration tasks. So I'm sorry, it did finish. My screen just didn't update on that side. So I'm going to load back up the dashboard and go back to DFW. And this is very important because of these security groups. Oops, wrong one. Testing objects. Because remember, I injected those temporary IP sets in the environment, but let's say I'm ready to move my VMs over. I want the VMs actually to be members of this group. That's what we call a post-migration task on here. So if I click on post-migration tasks, I'm going to see a bunch of things that will become available to me once I've flagged the system as fully complete. It's still doing the cleanup of the logical switches on the side. So I can assign tags to VMs. I can assign the VMs to security groups, and I can also delete those temporary zero trust objects that we saw earlier. So for the sake of time, I'm going to pause. And when the actually 100% completes, I'll come back in here and show you the rest. But turn back over to Bill.
Yeah, great. Good stuff. I'm just amazed just watching the tool just whiz by and do all that amazing work for us. So this is a great tool. It's going to definitely help you do your migrations. So, in this particular use case, Matt created the logical switches in the target. So you saw that flexibility of the tool where you can migrate the switches first, get that over, and it maps all that for you. So if you have rules in V that reference the logical switch, it's going to keep track of that. So the Matt tool actually maps that information for us, which we did. And then after that portion is done, we're going to build the bridges to tie that all together. And then we're able to leverage Matt to do the firewall rule migration and get that in place. So you saw how the tool did the IP set injection and was able to move that along. And then we did this final REST NSX final migration of rules. And this is all done in test. And then there's some post-migration tasks where we have to do the migration summary report. And then we do some validation, some spot checks to make sure things are good. And then now that everything's there, we're ready to actually start the migration. But first, we got to validate the bridging, make sure it's good. And we're going to migrate some test workloads. This is where the rubber is really hitting the road, right? Where we actually validate the bridges, we migrate a few test workloads, right? Make sure everything's working good. And then we do this gateway flip. So 27 Virtual has a script that we created that actually flips the gateway from the V side to the T side to minimize the downtime. Now, when workloads go across the bridge, you might not even lose the ping drop. Sometimes none, maybe one. But when you flip the gateway over on the T side, the physical route switch infrastructure may take a bit to learn the new NSX-T segments in BGP. And that can take about 3, 5, 10 seconds, maybe a little bit longer. It really varies from one customer's environment to the other. It could be a little bit shorter. It could be a little bit longer, right? Once that gateway flip is over, right, everything's moved over. And then the last step is to do the post-migration tasks, which is to associate the tags to VMs, which is very important. So the Matt tool can do that. It's going to map the VMs to security groups to make sure everything matches up. So the mat tool is going to keep track of what group it was in V into T. When the VMs get moved over, though, there's no way to know with the association. But with mat in place, it actually remembers that mapping and then can apply those tags to those VMs. Very, very important. And then the last step is a cleanup of the injected IP sets in T. You saw the IP sets being injected at the zero trust. So you got to clean those out of the T environment. I don't really care about the V because it's going away anyway. And then we have our application owners, do the testing, right? So it's a very, very good process, right? So DJ, do you want to show the post-migration tests?
Sure. I was just doing some stuff because of for the sake of time. I was trying to clean stuff off already.
Okay.
I'm on a different screen. If I can get back to the other screen after I finish this, I will show that if we have time. Okay. But in general, the one comment I'll make on that last step you have there, cleaning up of injected IP sets, is that that's also an automated approach, which is, the point and click of creating them is the same as cleaning them up, where all our VMs and workloads are on T. Let's get rid of them. Go into the UI, click, remove IP sets. We'll remove them from the rule. We'll also delete the IP set itself. So just point of clarification on that.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm just going to kind of repeat the process, right? So you build a test environment. We use the policy engine to sync V to V. We build the environment in V and the test just like production. We get all the V stuff synced V to V. We build a brand new T environment, right? We're going to build the segments using the mat tool because we need to get that VNI number from that NSX-V switch over and get it mapped out. We're going to build the bridges, get everything in place. We're going to go through this process of cleaning up and learning how to clean up the rules. Now, the cleanup process for this particular case study was done in production and then synced V to V. So by the time we get to the production migration, just to be clear, that the cleanup process that DJ showed earlier with the object analyzer using the REST NSX tool, and just to be clear, there's two different tools here. There's the mat tool that he's showing that does the migration and the injection of the IP sets and the migration of the rules and the networking, all those different components. And there's REST NSX itself that we leverage to do the analyzing of the rules and cleaning up the rules, which is really, really cool stuff, right? We get it all built. We're doing it in a parallel test environment. We get the bridges in place. We migrate those test workloads across the bridge, make sure everything's good, make sure we understand how it works. And there are some specifics to bridging. Again, it's too much to get into in this particular webinar. And then we do this gateway flip. So that means that we've already migrated all the rules. The segments were built. We migrated all the rules. And now we're ready to actually move everything completely over to T from a route switch perspective. And then the last step is to do these mat post-migration cleanups. Because the big thing, if you're using groups and tags, let's say if you're using groups and tags in V, when you initially move things over to V, we don't know that they're there yet. We have to have something to kind of tie it all together. And mat is the magic pixie dust that like links that all together and kind of finishes that off. So it's a really great process to go through. And this right here just shows the 27 virtual simple script that'll help make the gateway flip more seamless. We want to make that as smooth as possible. So once the VMs are migrated over, the last step is to flip the gateway. So currently the gateway is in V on the left. We migrate the workloads over to the new segment, using the mat tool to do that mapping for us to get that VNI number the same. And then we run a script that will actually flip that. So the workloads are all moved over. The firewall rules are over. We're flipping it. And now we're going to wait 3, 5, 7, 10 seconds, depending on the environment, for the physical BGP to pick up that route, right? And at that point, we're over, but we still have to clean up, right? And I'll come back to you, DJ, in just a minute. Maybe you can have that ready to show those last cleanup steps. But the point I want to make here before we go on, and I want to pause for any questions, is that at this point, the migration basically has been fully tested. So now we're ready to go to prod and actually do it. And the point that I like to make is that all the work has pretty much been done because we've learned all the lessons here. We've done all the testing, we built it all out. So now when we go to the actual production environment, we really know in detail what needs to be done to make it work. And the object analyzer has already cleaned up the rules and brought it down that 22%, which is really important. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
I think one item I'd like to highlight for this particular customer is that because of the strategy we used here is with the Mat appliances, that we pointed it to the production NSX-V manager and did a collection that we showed you earlier and extracted out all those temporary IP sets via CSV file and use those to inject using 27 virtual scripts into NSX-V. So not only were we able to get the production firewall rules and objects into the lab for mock migrations, we were also able to get the actual IP addresses of the VMs in those temporary IP sets so that when we created those, call it 100 VMs in the lab for testing, it was real life on there. So it's just another way of using tooling to do these mock migrations, test migrations before we actually click the real button during migration. So I thought that was very important to highlight because of there's one thing to have a copy of rules, but there's also another thing to have the effective rules into the lab environment.
That's right. Give me just 1 second here.
While we're waiting for questions, I will share again because I wanted to recognize the time constraints here is that I did go ahead and start cleaning up the environment. So this is one of those post-migration tasks where we can clean up the NSX-V environment and or the NSX-T environment. So I did the V environment and I kicked off the T environment. It's not quite done yet. It's still going through those. But if we go back to the NSX-V firewall rule set, we click refresh in that rule where we testing objects, we notice that we're back to where we were. We have just the cluster, and then we also just have the security group tag only on here, right? Didn't change anything about it. It's just how it was. So this is, to Bill's point, a way of not only being able to test in the lab, but also test different scenarios. Because the one thing I didn't show you within the Mat application is the ability for you to define how you want the migration to look. For example, if you say, you know what, I don't want those security groups in NSX-T to have the VMs as members, I want you to convert them to IP addresses, we'll do that for you. So you can really dictate what the migration looks like based on global settings within the application. And obviously, last but not least, from our perspective, is the ability to roll back, within the application. And I could easily click this button, roll back, and I'm going to be back to the NSX-T state that I was prior. Again, not touching anything else, just what we did in this actual migration.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is you can clean up the, you can roll back and you can also clean up the V environment as well. So if you need to run through it again, you can do it. And
yep, rinse and repeat.
Rinse and repeat.
Until you're happy with the results.
Okay, so now we go to production, apply lessons learned. So I'm going to pop it over to Chris here for a minute. So what kind of lessons learned did we gather throughout this process, Chris?
Well, for this particular case study, we found some services that were not supported in NSX-T that we had to clean up. We found some scaling issues that we addressed, and DJ was very helpful from NSX. We found some of those limits of the tool, and we were able to address those so that going forward, not only would our migration be successful, but future migrations at this scale would be successful. And I think the primary thing that we did for preparation is the rule cleanup. And like I said, we were at about 18,000 rules and we removed about 22%. But this customer is continually creating hundreds of rules per month, if not more. So even though we did a large cleanup effort and then a subsequent cleanup effort, we ended up at 15,000 by the time we got to the migration. So it was a very large scale migration. We also did some preparation for the production environment. We got vCenter up to 7.0 so that we can support the VDS 7 so that we could use converged VDS. And this was kind of in parallel to the test preparation and testing. We did migration planning. And Bill, I don't know if you want to continue on or do you want me to continue, but up to you.
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of bounce back and forth here. So you built, so you made sure you had vSphere 7 in the production target, right? Now, this particular customer, did they have new hardware or did you just repurpose existing hardware?
They had a few seat hosts, but it was almost entirely a lift and shift using the old hardware.
Right. So we made sure we had the right version of vCenter, the right version of vSphere on the host. We had some seed hardware. We pulled some stuff out. So we had the environment cleaned up. The rules are cleaned up. We deployed and validate NSX-T in the target. So were there any challenges there? Like you said, you had to kind of get NSX-T deployed as a target. Was there any challenges in that portion?
Not that I can remember. It was pretty straightforward because we had done such extensive testing in the test environment.
Right. So we got NSX-T deployed in the target. That means we have all the edges deployed. We got all the T0s, the T1s, all the BGP peering set up. Everything's ready to go and everything's been fully tested. And then what about the migration waves? So you can talk about that a little bit. So what was that like to plan this huge migration? How did those waves go and what order did you do it in?
We were initially planning to do multiple weeks of migration. The customer ended up deciding that was not something that was feasible because they have such a large role base of continually making changes. So we ended up going to just 2 weekends. We had a pre-prod weekend and then a production weekend. We took some lessons learned from the pre-prod environment, made some changes, and then we had a very successful production weekend, which was, of course, the most important one.
About how many VMs did you migrate in both waves? What did that number look like?
It was about 1,700 in both cases. So we were using some scripting that the customer developed to do the vMotions, make that automated and make it so that there were fewer chances for manual accidental clicks, let's say. And then we leveraged our gateway flipping script to do that, and that worked out very well. Only missed a few pings. We had about 16 bridges deployed simultaneously. So it was a very extensive and large migration, as you can imagine.
So 15,000 firewall rules, 15 bridges, 2 migration waves, about 1,700 VMs, and all these massive big list of firewall rules. And you're able to do it across those 2 weekends. Now,
yes.
The last step there is, once you get the environment ready, was there a process to do a validation once the VMs are landed on the other site?
Right. So as this slide is pointing out, you definitely need to let application owners know. We're doing things very early in the morning or late in the night, depending on how you want to see it. They did some testing. Of course, we had to have a whole migration team. We had contact plan set up so that everyone knows who's on schedule for what particular times, who to contact when things need to be tested or whatever the case may be. We had a rollback plan. We just tried to map this out as well as we could beforehand so that it would go smoothly. And if it didn't go smoothly, we would know exactly what to do. So
yeah, I think one thing, Chris, that I think sometimes gets lost in translation here, which I think was a very important step, is that the customer is able during the normal week do some workload validation because of the way we did this migration, which was using those temporary IP sets in NSX-T. So they could bring a VM over, do some testing based upon IP addressing, whatever it is, test it out, move it back, whatever it is. And so the final validation was that post-migration task of assigning tags to VMs, which was done, in the change window of that final weekend, where I think the number was 1,600, 1,700 VMs in different waves were tagged as they moved to T, and then the policies were validated again. So I think it's just important to highlight that we were able to do some pre-validation before the actual outage window.
Yeah, and you just pointed out a great thing. That tagging, the post-migration tagging task, can be done multiple times. So you can move over a segment, tag all the VMs, and continue on. So that means that your tags will be enforced almost immediately after the VMs are over. So that's can be helpful if you're doing multiple waves. You can do, let's say for this particular example, we did the tagging for the pre-prod environment right after we finished that one. and then we could do the tagging for production, and we wouldn't have to be relying on those temporary IP sets for as long.
Yep, exactly right. And just to wrap it up, is that when Bill was speaking, I clicked the rollback button and we rolled back everything of the NSX-T environment that we built during that migration. If we go back in NSX-T and refresh DFW sections, these are just the ones that were there. We go over to networking. If you remember, we had one tier one and one segment in this environment. Now it is back to where we were. So this is one of the beauties of being able to just do this over and over again until you get everything exactly how you want it.
Yeah, that's great. So then there's this prep to actually go do it, in production. So we have the MAT created logical switches. So we use the MAT tool versus the REST API. So the MAT tool is going to, in the case again, where you have NSX-V firewall rules that reference logical switches, it's important to use the MAT tool to help map that over so that that can be maintained. So that means that the knowledge of that switch, the VNI number, and the application of the rule to that switch is maintained as part of the migration, right? So using MAT allows this mapping to continue in a way that's maintained across the migration. If you have a source environment where there are no logical switches referenced in a firewall rule, that definitely makes it a lot simpler. In that case, you could just use the REST API to create the switches where the VNI number matches to make the bridge be a smooth build. But in that situation where the firewall rules are actually referencing the logical switch, it's important to ID that and track that so that can be maintained as you migrate those rules over. The bridging deployment, again, Chris said, what, 16 bridges, determine the number. It's a lot of bridges.
And they were also an NHA pair, which is an active standby construct. There's no active, but so you can imagine there were 32 edges in total. It's a very extensive resource use, but we tested all of them individually, and then we were able to get going.
Right, so you got all these bridges deployed, right, Chris? You do some testing, you make sure they're rock solid, right? You do some testing, make sure the bridges are good because you're not flipping the gateway quite yet, right? So you make sure they're good. Another thing that, if you could talk about it, this safety net. So what if for some reason you migrated the VMs over and you found a rule maybe wasn't correct or a tag wasn't applied? Can you talk about what the safety net is approach?
Right, so you can put in a temporary allow rules towards the top of the firewall so that if you have any blocks in place, they'll be superseded by that. The rule evaluation, just like in B, is to the first rule that's evaluated is the one at the top, and then any subsequent rules won't even be looked at. So you could put in a temporary allow any to any with any service rule if you need to, or you can use something more targeted. If it's just one application, of course, that would be the ideal. You just limit to that application, any to that application, and then that application, any. You can use the logical switch object, like I was saying before, where if it's if you bring over the VMs to NSX-T, they'll immediately be recognized instead of a tag-based approach where those tags would effectively be not applied until you do the post-migration task. So you have a few options there. Of course, you'll need approval from your security team because temporary allow all rule will probably get rid of your security posture entirely, but it is temporary and it's usually during a maintenance window and all that, but it can help. So it depends on what works best for your particular migration.
Yeah, and just like we saw, the IP set injection is going to take place. Now we're actually doing it for real. We're going to schedule and implement a freeze so that, that way we can avoid having to create rules in both sides. So there could be a scenario where if you don't implement a freeze, you would end up having to build rules in V and in T if something had been migrated. So schedule, implement the distributed firewall freeze to avoid having to create duplicate rules on both sides. And then we do that final magic day when we do the final migration of all those rules for production. Again, DJ just demonstrated the ability to roll back if there's an issue. We've done a lot of testing to make sure that it's good. And then the final rule migration. Now here, the number of rules will vary the time, but again, about 20 hours to migrate in this case. Is that right?
Yeah.
And Making sure the environment's ready, making sure things are installed right, the right client, everything's there. And then again, the post-migration task, phase 1 is we've migrated. We're going to run that migration summary report to make sure everything looks good. DJ called out some things to look for, things that don't work, like, multiple application IDs to services, those kind of things. There's a few things to be aware of. Look at the summary report. If there's any cleanup needs to be done, you can do it there. There's that microsegmentation validation where we compare the sections in V to the sections in T and the rule count. So we're kind of doing a spot check to make sure that after the rule migration is done, everything's in alignment. And then you're ready to migrate. So there's not much here. At this point now, everything's done. You're going to pick your migration windows, your phases. You're going to start migrating the VMs. In this case, the customer had a script that they wrote to help migrate the VMs over. Once the VMs are moved over, you leverage the script to flip the gateway. And then we do that final post-migration task where we assign the tags to the VMs, associate VMs to vCenter objects, logical switches to groups. Again, it depends on how the original rules were built. And the last step, right, would be, well, actually, maybe that's out of order. Application owners would validate everything. Maybe you let it sit for a week based on the customer's comfort level. And then you can actually go there and clean those injected IP sets out of T. Any other thoughts there, Chris?
Yeah, so the last step within MAT would be to clean up the injected IP sets. If you have the application owners testing before that's done, then it may not be an accurate test, which is why I kind of ordered it that way. So maybe we could have brought that over a little bit, but the idea is the last step within MAT is definitely to do the cleanup of the T, and then you can have real validation of your final firewall configuration when everything is completely as it will be going forward. So,
yeah, I guess that's right. Or you didn't have them doing 2 validations almost, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's your post-migration cleanup. So now this particular customer, due to the lift and shift of the servers, they actually had to add more edges at the end. They didn't have enough resources to put all the edges that they wanted. This is kind of unique to this case study. So due to lack of resources, once everything was done, they actually had more resources. Now they brought the servers. They've swung those additional servers over. So now they actually deployed some more edge nodes. That's kind of unique. At some point, you're going to remove the bridges when the customer's comfortable with that. And then you can do the standard vCenter cluster cleanup stuff, rename clusters. Do you have anything that points to a cluster by name? Because you might have new cluster names as part of the migration, a script or anything like that. Maybe resource pools or reservations need to be set up. Standard vCenter, vSphere type things. And then when you're all done, remove NSX-V. But don't remove it until you're sure you're not going to roll back, right? So once you're confident everything looks good, the very, very last step is to remove NSX-V off any remaining host you may have left. If you have any left, that's questionable, and then you're good to go. Chris or DJ, any last thoughts?
Not for me.
Yeah, not for me. Thanks.
And DJ, let's you talk to this last slide.
Absolutely. So this is, more from a perspective of REST NSX software, because to recap, we're a software provider. Myself and the other co-founder of the company, we left VMware a few years ago to start our own software company to focus on problems just like this. We had a lot of NSX experience and thought we could create some pretty good software to get things done. So in summary, these are some of the stats that we're talking about as our software has been used with partners and customers alike around the globe. Most of the customer assessments, probably the biggest takeaway is that 60% of those assessments that we showed you at the beginning of begin the data collection revealed information that customers had no idea that they had. If they had no idea they had a VM and a firewall, right? I can think of countless examples where there's dozens and dozens of these along their side. But in general, our approach is to work with partners like 27 Virtual, a very, very talented engineering organization who's been doing this a very long time, know our tools very well, knows NSX and VMware products very well, to get you guys to NSX-T. So I highly recommend working with them and hopefully us. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining, as well as Will, Chris, and DJ for presenting and answering our questions today. We hope today's presentation has been helpful for you and your organization.